I could go on, but I think the credulity of the one group and the duplicity of the other group is crystal clear here. And it only remains to be seen whether or not it's going to pass muster with the courts. And I'm afraid that the people who are in charge of enforcing the law are unfortunately also on the side of the people that are writing the law right now, and that's where you're going to get into some big problems. So, okay, that's one example. Second example that I have here is what you can do when you have power and you believe things that aren't true. And in this case, I don't know whether this guy is lying about his beliefs, whether it's just wishful thinking, or whether he's just a fool. I have no idea, or maybe all of the above. But we'll read this story, and then you'll see what I'm talking about. So this is from Vox, and it's entitled, "Jeff Sessions is exerting unprecedented control over immigration courts by ruling on cases himself." If that sounds unusual, I'll give away the ending and say, yes, it's very unusual for him to do that. Okay, so the story reads as follows. The fate of tens of thousands of immigrants' court cases could rest in the hands of Attorney General Jeff Sessions. That's not a metaphor. Sessions has stepped into the immigration system in an unprecedented manner, giving himself and his office the ability to review and rewrite cases that could set precedents for a large share of the hundreds of thousands of immigrants with pending immigration court cases, not to mention all those who are arrested and put into the deportation process in the future. He's doing this by taking cases from the Board of Immigration Appeals, the Justice Department agency that serves as a quasi-appellate body for immigration court cases, and referring them to himself to issue a decision instead. Sessions isn't giving lawyers much information about what he's planning, but he's set himself up, if he wants, to make it radically harder for immigration judges to push cases off their docket to be resolved elsewhere or paused indefinitely, and to close the best opportunities that tens of thousands of asylum seekers, including most Central Americans, have to stay in the United States. And he might be gearing up to extend his involvement even further by giving himself the authority to review a much bigger swath of rulings issued in the immigration court system. The Attorney General has the power to set immigration precedents, but Attorney Generals rarely used that power until now. Most immigrants who are apprehended in the U.S. without papers have a right to a hearing in immigration court to determine whether they can be deported and whether they qualify for some form of legal status or other relief from deportation. The same process exists for people who are caught crossing into the U.S. but who claim to be eligible for some sort of relief, like asylum, and pass an initial screening. In both cases, only after the judge issues a final order of removal can the immigrant be deported. Immigration courts aren't part of the judicial branch. They're under the authority of the Department of Justice. Their judges are supposed to have some degree of independence, and some judges are certainly harsher on immigrants and asylum seekers than others. But their decisions are guided by precedent from the Board of Immigration Appeals, which is basically the appellate court of the immigration system, and which also answers to the DOJ and the Attorney General. If the Attorney General doesn't like that precedent, he has the power to change it by referring a case to himself after the Board of Immigration Appeals has reviewed it, issuing a new ruling, and telling the immigration courts to abide by the precedent that ruling sets in the future. Attorneys General rarely ever use that power. Sessions has used it 3 times since the beginning of 2018. All 3 cases are still under review. I can't remember this many decisions being certified in the past 5 to 10 years, says Kate Voigt of the American Immigration Lawyers Association. In theory, Sessions' office is supposed to make its decisions based on amicus briefs from outside parties, as well as the immigrants' lawyers and the Immigration and Customs Enforcement prosecutor. But advocates and lawyers groups say they can't file a good brief if they don't know what exactly the cases Sessions is getting involved in actually are, and Sessions is withholding that information. In one of the cases Sessions has referred to himself, the DOJ refused to provide a copy of the decision that Sessions is reviewing or any information about where the case came from and who the immigrant's lawyer was. In another case, congressional staff happened to find the decision under review on a DOJ website days before the deadline for amicus briefs. That opacity makes it basically impossible to know whether Sessions is planning to issue relatively narrow rulings or very broad ones. In the case in which the decision under review was discovered by congressional staffers, both the immigrant's lawyer and the Department of Homeland Security, serving as the prosecution, asked Sessions' office to clarify the specific legal question at hand in the review. In other words, to give them a hint of the scope of the potential proceeding being set. They were denied. "We have no idea how broad he's going," said Eleanor Acer of the advocacy group Human Rights First. "The way it was framed was totally inscrutable." Excuse me. To Acer and other lawyers and advocates, that uncertainty is worrisome. All three of the cases Sessions has referred to himself center on questions that, depending on how they're answered, could result in rulings that tip the balance of tens of thousands of immigration court cases. Can judges remove cases from the docket? In the case Sessions referred to himself in January, matter of Castro/Toom, he asked the question of whether judges are allowed to use something called administrative closure to remove a case from the docket, essentially hitting the pause button on it indefinitely. Administrative closures were common under the Obama administration, as ICE prosecutors used it to stop the deportation process for low-priority unauthorized immigrants. They're already much less common under Trump. A Reuters analysis found that closures dropped from 56,000 in Obama's last year in office to 20,000 in Trump's first year, but that's still 20,000 immigrants whose deportation cases were halted, and 20,000 cases cleared out of an ever-growing immigration court backlog. If it's written broadly enough, the forthcoming Sessions decision could prevent administrative closure from being even a possibility. Are victims of private violence eligible for asylum? In a March self-referral, Sessions asked whether a judge should be allowed to grant asylum to a domestic violence survivor because she was a victim of private violence, violence that wasn't state-based. Theoretically, asylum is supposed to be available only for victims of certain types of persecution. But some judges have found that women in some countries who experience domestic violence are being persecuted for membership in their social group, i.e., of being women. This self-referral has raised red flags for a lot of domestic violence groups, which are worried that Sessions is about to cut off an important path to relief for some immigrant survivors. But it could be even broader. Gang violence is also private violence, and the social group clause has also been used to give asylum to people fleeing gang violence in Honduras and El Salvador. There is no dispute under U.S. law that asylum claims may be based on persecution conducted by non-governmental actors. Human Rights First's Acer told Vox, as long as the asylum seeker shows her government was unwilling or unable to protect her. But Sessions appears to be directly attacking, essentially, whether a non-state actor can ever qualify as a persecutor. For many of the thousands of Central Americans who've entered the U.S. in recent years, that provision has been their best chance to stay here rather than being sent home, and it could be taken away with a stroke of Sessions' pen. Can an immigration judge wait for an application to be approved? In his other March self-referral, Sessions appears to be taking aim at continuances, a practice of judges kicking the can down the road in a case by scheduling it for the next available court date sometime in the future, often several months, in order for something else to be prepared or resolved. Sometimes continuances are requested because the immigrant in question is also involved in another legal proceeding that's relevant to the case. One example, An immigrant put into deportation proceedings by ICE in an immigration court run by the DOJ may still be eligible to apply for legal status for U.S. citizenship and immigration services while waiting for their application to be processed. Sessions is now asking himself whether it's legally valid to grant a continuance so the parallel legal proceedings can get resolved. This could affect tens of thousands of cases. A 2012 DOJ Office of the Inspector General report found that more than half of cases examined involving continuances, and 1/4 of all continuances involved requests from the immigrant to delay a case while an application was filed or processed or a background check was completed. Excuse me. At the end of April, lawyers concerned that Sessions is gearing up to issue a broad ruling in this case were amplified when a DOJ notification in the case mentioned 2 other immigrants whose cases were being combined with this one, indicating to some lawyers that the facts in the original case didn't lend themselves to the ruling Sessions had already decided to give. Furthermore, lawyers and advocates worry that Sessions is gearing up to restrict continuances in other circumstances, like allowing immigrants time to find a lawyer or prepare a case. Sessions' meddling might not make courts more efficient, but it will make them more brutal. Sessions and the Trump administration claim they're trying to restore efficiency to a backlogged court system that poses the biggest obstacle to the large-scale, swift deportation of border-crossing families and to unauthorized immigrants living in the U.S. But lawyers are convinced that Sessions' diktats, if they're as broad as feared, would just gum up the works further. If the Attorney General were seriously concerned about the backlog, as opposed to a desire for quick deportations, he would be focusing on transferring as many cases away from immigration judges as possible, Attorney Jeremy McKinney told Vox. Not forcing them to keep cases on their docket that they would rather close or that could be rendered moot by other decisions. It's not smart docket control. And Sessions isn't simply planning to issue these rulings and walk away. His office is planning to give itself even wider power over the immigration court system. A notice published as part of the department's spring 2018 regulatory agenda says, quote, "The Department of Justice proposes to change the circumstances in which the Attorney General may refer cases to himself for review. Such case types will include those pending before the Board of Immigration Appeals, but not yet decided, and certain immigration judge decisions regardless of whether those decisions have been appealed to the BIA." In other words, even when a DOJ judge makes a ruling in an immigrant's favor and ICE prosecutors don't try to appeal the ruling, the Attorney General's office could sweep in and overrule the judge. Sessions' decrees would probably result in more immigration judge decisions getting appealed to the Board of Immigration Appeals, further gumming up the works, as judges try to interpret precedents Sessions has set and from there to federal courts of appeals. Many federal judges aren't keen on the immigration court system, especially when its appeals gum up their own dockets, and they might step back in to push back against Sessions' changes. In the meantime, though, immigration judges will have fewer ways to move cases off their docket and fewer avenues for asylum seekers to qualify for relief, as they're simultaneously facing serious pressure to make quick decisions in as many cases as possible. The more pressure is put on immigration judges from above, and the more Sessions moves to block their safety valves, the less likely they are to give immigrants a chance to fully make their cases before they bang the gavel on their deportations. So, there's a lot of technicalities in here that are hard to follow for those of us who are not conversant in the processes. But what does stand out in this story is that a single person, Jeff Sessions, is manipulating the system in order to remove a lot of the democratic processes that are in place, courts, judges, juries, etc., and simply find a way to make his desires, to put his stamp on everything, and to make what his desired outcome come true, regardless of what people who are working on the cases, who are involved in the cases, who know the people involved, and who are dealing with it, think about it. So this is basically an unprecedented power grab by this person who wants to put his stamp and impose his desired outcomes on a system that is set up as a system in order to make it possible for things to be examined on an individual basis. It is at the least undemocratic, and at the most just absurdly dictatorial. I mean, it's a terrible situation. And this is a guy who believes or purports to believe that immigrants are criminals, that they're coming here with drugs and causing crime and wreaking havoc and doing all these different sorts of things. And that's pretty serious business. If this person who was doing this was doing it because he had a good understanding of what was actually going on, you might allow him some leeway, or you might say, well, let's see how this turns out, what he's doing here. But because we already know that he either doesn't understand or he doesn't care, or he has ulterior nefarious motives, then it is a very serious and troublesome thing that's going on here. And there again, the outcome, whether it's credulity or duplicity, is going to be more or less the same. But how one might approach him to get him to not do this stuff would be different depending on which it is, and we don't know. So that's something to be watching and to be aware of. Okay, I had a bunch more stories, but I think I'm only probably going to have time for this one more. And this is something I've gone over again and again and again, but I think it's worth bringing up because it's, whoa, pounding on the table here. It's worth bringing up because it's a true fact that needs to be faced, that we need to understand about this situation and why we're in it. This is entitled, Why Republicans Will Never Reform Immigration. The Republican Party is never going to reform immigration, and it isn't just because of Donald Trump. The party's other leaders have decided that immigration is something you can talk about, use as an electoral wedge issue, or bang your fist about, like I was just doing. But there will be no attempt to actually make policy on it, at least not anything that resembles the reform we've been promised for years. We saw that clearly last week when a small group of Republicans, most but not all, representing swing districts with significant Latino constituencies, or who are retiring from the House, as the Washington Post noted, started a bit of a rebellion, attempting to get votes on the House floor on immigration reform proposals. They were trying to do it via a discharge petition, a parliamentary technique that involves getting a majority of members to overrule the Speaker of the House, who controls the schedule, and force a vote. But Paul Ryan was having none of it. Quote, having some kind of spectacle on the floor that results in a veto doesn't solve this problem, he said. What I don't want to do is have a process that just ends up with a veto. We actually want to solve the DACA problem. End quote. But does he? It depends on your definition of want. I'm sure that in some corner of Republican lawmakers' hearts there is a bit of sympathy for dreamers, the young people brought here as children who have done everything right and now face the prospect of deportation. President Trump, for instance, has talked many times about how he'll treat those terrific kids with compassion, but he also canceled the DACA program, and he has lamented the fact that we get so many immigrants from, and I won't say it on the air, certain countries. You've probably heard his expression in full in other places. Arguing that, quote, we should have more people from places like Norway, end quote. His chief of staff, John Kelly, says that the trouble with undocumented immigrants is that they're not people that would easily assimilate into the United States, into our modern society. The very fact that Trump is president shows why his party is incapable of reforming immigration or ever coming to some sort of grand bargain of the type that has often been suggested, in which he'd get funding for his border wall and Democrats would get protection for dreamers. After the 2012 election, the party commissioned an autopsy to figure out where it should go next. We must embrace and champion comprehensive immigration reform, it said. If we do not, our party's appeal will continue to shrink to its core constituencies only. It also said that the Republican Party is one of tolerance and respect, and we need to ensure that the tone of our message is always reflective of these core principles. Pardon me while I choke up here. Then Donald Trump came along and said, oh yeah? Well, get a load of this. It's important to remember that the crowded field of Republican candidates Trump joined in 2015 were dancing carefully around the immigration issue. They knew it was tricky. The base didn't like anything that could be characterized as amnesty for undocumented immigrants, but they needed to look reasonable and moderate for the general election. But Trump, who has a sixth sense for the most rancid poison swirling around in the voters' id, realized they were all wrong. Forget about what the broader electorate says they want. The road to victory, he realized, was paved with hate and fear. He was different from the rest of the GOP contenders in many ways, but more than anything else, he was the one that presented the most unadorned version of white nationalism on offer. It wasn't an act, and it got him both the nomination and the presidency, but it goes beyond Trump. Imagine that he decided not to run for re-election, and a passel of GOP senators and governors tried to lead the party in 2020. Do you think any of them would propose comprehensive immigration reform? Would they be foolish enough to think that they could win over the party's base that way? For Republicans in Congress, the calculation is much the same. There are some that favor it publicly, but most Republicans represent districts and states where their biggest fear is a primary challenge from the right. And nothing will get you that challenge quicker than going soft on the foreign horde. The events of the last year and a half were predictable. The canceling of the DACA program, a wider immigration crackdown, and the occasional insincere assurance from Republicans that they really do want to do comprehensive reform eventually, just not now. So if you're waiting for it, and some people are with their very lives at stake, the bad news is that you're going to have to wait until there's a Democratic president and a Democratic Congress. And even then, Republicans are going to put up a fight. I can't disagree with pretty much anything about that article. I agree with all of it. And again, that takes us back to our question of credulity versus duplicity. I feel fairly safe in making the assumption that most, not all, but most of the politicians, most of the Republicans in power at this time know better about immigration and immigrants than the policies they are voting for and supporting or not bothering to vote for, not allowing to come to a vote, would suggest. I will also go out on a limb, and I think I'm fairly safe in doing so, in saying that the bulk of their supporters are credulous. They are ignorant, I will say it, about the realities, about the facts, and they are basing their support for policies that embody or encapsulate or articulate their prejudices, their misconceptions, their bigotry, and yes, in many cases, their racism. Like I said earlier, this is a self-reinforcing feedback loop where, you know, the more the politicians talk about it, the more the public eats it up and feeds it back to them, and it goes back and forth and back and forth. Ultimately, like I said, it doesn't matter which it is. The end result is pain and suffering for a lot of people. But how we as activists, we as people who care, fight that is difficult to decide. It's difficult to define because you're trying to educate one group while the people they're trusting and voting for and who are representing their interests, they think, are trying to miseducate them, who are they going to listen to? The people that they're already opposed to or the people that they already support? So I'm not sure at this point that we can do anything but every possible election, all the way up and down the spectrum of offices, we go out and fight for people who at least seem to understand what's going on and have some real idea of where things are. And then along with that, do what we're doing now. Certainly what CU Immigration Forum is trying to do, which is support the immigrants that we have here. Help them find services that they need, and just try to educate the few people that are on the fringes who don't really know one way or the other, haven't already made up their mind, and could make good use of correct information. Now, I got a text here earlier, which I should make a point. Let's see, email, okay. What email? Okay. Before, I only have a couple minutes left. Ricardo has sent me a message urging me to remind you about the Immigration Project fundraiser this Wednesday. Here we go. Here's the email. Community members and leaders, thank you for your assistance thus far in 2018 in promoting a welcoming community and assisting the Immigration Project Champaign office with its work in the Champaign community. I wanted to make sure that everyone in the community is invited to our next Champaign fundraiser. It is this week, May 16th. That's Wednesday, from 5:30 to 7:30 at Mais at the station. Tickets are $50 and you can pay online below at the immigrationproject.org, Party with a Purpose. So just go to www.immigrationproject.org/Party with a Purpose, all one word. Or you can pay at the door. So for those who don't know, the station, the old train station downtown, which is just off of University Avenue, right next to the train tracks, across the street from the new transportation station, that's the station. And Mais is a Mexican restaurant. They have a location on campus, which you've probably eaten at, that has like 2 tables and room for about 3 people to stand and maybe 4 or 5 to sit. But their new place at the station is a lot larger, and it's just as good, and it's very comfortable. So they're holding a party this Wednesday, not today, not tomorrow, but Wednesday, from 5:30 to 7:30 p.m. Tickets are $50, and I think you will enjoy it, and it's a chance to support the Immigration Project, and they have been very helpful in any number of ways. And your $50 ticket includes hors d'oeuvres and a drink. And there's live music from flamenco guitarist Brandon Chop. Brandon Chop. Doesn't that sound like a great name? Brandon Chop. Okay, so Party with a Purpose, 5/16/18. That's this Wednesday from 5:30 to 7:30 at Mais Mexican Grill, 100 North Chestnut Street, Unit C, for those with GPS who want to check it out. I don't have any more time to talk. I thank you for listening to the show. I hope you'll tune in again next time, and we'll see you later.